Hi guys, tonight, we travel back into one of the quietest corners of the ancient world, where history was not shaped by loud voices or sudden moments, but by ordinary hands that repeated the same gentle work each day. Long before the first light reached the wide river, before the birds stirred among the reeds, and before warm sunlight settled across fields of grain, there were already people waking in silence. The night was still soft around them. A few stars remained above the dark outline of the desert, and a cool breeze drifted slowly across the Nile. The air carried the faint smell of damp earth mixed with clay, river water, and the ashes of cooking fires that had gone quiet only a few hours before. In a village built from mud brick, where every home looked much like the one beside it, a family rested together beneath simple woven blankets. Their home was small, but it held everything they truly needed. Thick walls kept away much of yesterday's heat. A reed mat covered the floor. Clay jars stood patiently against one wall, filled with water gathered from the river before sunset. A wooden stool, worn smooth by years of use, waited beside a low table where bread had been shared the evening before. Nothing inside the house was meant to impress anyone. Every object had earned its place through usefulness. Every bowl, basket, rope, and clay pot had been shaped by someone whose own daily life looked much the same. The quiet would not last much longer. Before dawn fully arrived, someone inside the house slowly opened tired eyes. There was no loud alarm, no sudden rush, only the familiar feeling that another day had quietly begun. The body already remembered the routine before the mind had fully awakened. Outside, the village remained wrapped in gentle darkness. Somewhere nearby, a donkey shifted its weight. A goat softly called from its small shelter. Farther away, the slow sound of water brushing against the riverbank blended with the whisper of reeds moving in the wind. The Nile was awake long before people spoke. Its calm current carried life through the land every single day. It asked for nothing, yet quietly gave almost everything. Water for drinking. Rich soil for planting. Fish for eating. Easy travel between distant villages. Without the river, there would have been little reason for people to gather here. With it, generation after generation found enough to continue living. Inside the house, movement remained slow. A woman carefully rose from her sleeping place, careful not to wake the youngest child beside her. She stepped onto the cool floor, where fine dust had settled overnight. Her linen clothing, folded neatly before sleeping, waited nearby. She wrapped it around herself with practiced hands before reaching for a small clay lamp. A tiny flame appeared. Its gentle light filled only a small corner of the room, leaving soft shadows dancing against the walls. The smell of oil mixed quietly with the cool morning air. Soon another member of the family stirred. Then another. No one needed to ask what today would bring. Today would bring what yesterday had brought. Work. The work itself might change with the season, but the rhythm rarely changed. Fields needed tending. Nets needed repairing. Bread needed baking. Clay needed shaping. Buildings needed maintaining. Boats needed loading. Children needed guiding. Animals needed feeding. Civilizations often appear grand when remembered from many centuries away. Massive temples rise before the imagination. Giant statues seem almost impossible to carve. Stone monuments stand beneath endless blue skies, appearing timeless and untouched. Yet those remarkable places were never built in a single day. They grew slowly, one ordinary morning after another. Each sunrise added only a little. One basket of stone. One loaf of bread. One line written by a patient scribe. One brick left to dry beneath the sun. One field carefully watered. one family quietly beginning another day. As dawn slowly brightened the eastern sky, the first pale light entered the doorway of the little house. The stars faded one by one. A gentle orange glow spread across the distant desert hills. Soon smoke began rising from several homes throughout the village. Breakfast was simple. Grain, carefully ground the previous evening, became rough bread. Water was poured from cool clay jars. Sometimes onions, dates, or figs rested beside the meal. On fortunate mornings there might be a little cheese or dried fish. Nothing was wasted. Every bite mattered because each person would soon spend long hours beneath the growing heat. Children awoke gradually. Their responsibilities depended upon their age, yet even the youngest learned by watching. They observed hands kneading dough. They watched older brothers prepare tools. They saw fathers checking woven baskets for signs of wear. Every routine quietly became a lesson. No classroom existed here. Daily life itself was the teacher. Outside, neighbors greeted one another with calm familiarity. No one hurried through elaborate conversations. Everyone understood the morning's purpose. A farmer carried a wooden hoe across one shoulder. Another balanced coiled rope beside several empty baskets. Two young boys walked together while rubbing sleep from their eyes. An elderly man leaned gently upon a smooth wooden staff polished by decades of use. His pace was slower now. The village adjusted around him. He no longer carried the heaviest loads, yet his knowledge remained valuable. Younger workers listened when he explained the river's changing moods, the best planting days, or the careful repair of irrigation channels. Experience moved quietly from one generation into the next, not through speeches, but through shared labor. As sunlight strengthened, the warmth slowly returned. The desert never rushed. Heat arrived little by little until every stone, every wall, and every path seemed to hold it. The fields beyond the village stretched peacefully beside the Nile. Dark fertile soil rested where floodwaters had once covered the land. Tiny green shoots reached upward, promising harvests still many weeks away. Workers spread across the fields with measured movements. Nobody wasted energy. The day would be long enough. The rhythm of farming depended less upon clocks than upon sunlight, weather, and water. Hands worked steadily. Wooden tools pressed into soft earth. Feet sank gently into damp soil. Water shimmered inside carefully dug canals before slipping quietly toward thirsty crops. Some workers paused only briefly to wipe sweat from their foreheads. Others adjusted wide baskets hanging from their shoulders. Nearby, birds searched the fields for insects stirred by the movement of people. Nothing seemed dramatic. Everything seemed necessary. Farther along the riverbank, fishermen prepared their boats. The Nile reflected the growing morning light like polished bronze. Simple wooden vessels rested against the shore while nets were carefully unfolded. Every knot mattered. A single weak place could mean losing an entire catch. Fingers moved patiently over rough fibers, repairing tiny breaks that might easily escape an untrained eye. The work required calm attention. No one hurried. Fish would still be swimming whether the boat departed a few moments earlier or later. The river rewarded patience more often than speed. A father quietly showed his son how to fold part of the net so that it would spread evenly across the water. The lesson required very few words. The boy watched closely before repeating the movement himself. Learning happened this way throughout Egypt. Eyes first. Hands second. Words last. By the time the boats drifted away from shore, the village behind them had fully awakened. Smoke curled upward into the brightening sky. Dogs wandered dusty pathways searching for familiar scents. Women gathered near ovens where bread slowly baked against warm clay walls. The comforting smell spread gently through narrow streets. Fresh bread carried its own quiet promise. No matter how difficult the day's labor became, there would be food waiting again before night. Beyond the farming fields, another group of workers began their own familiar routines. Stonecutters inspected copper tools worn from yesterday's effort. Builders organized wooden sledges. Water carriers filled heavy jars that would help cool both workers and dusty pathways. Each task depended upon another. No single worker could build alone. The strongest laborer still needed someone to prepare food. The baker depended upon farmers. Farmers depended upon irrigation. Irrigation depended upon careful planning. Planning depended upon scribes who quietly measured harvests, supplies, and labor. Civilization rested not upon one extraordinary person but upon countless ordinary lives moving together with remarkable steadiness. The scribes themselves began work in places that were cooler than open fields but no less demanding. They sat cross-legged upon woven mats. Papyrus sheets rested carefully before them. Small cakes of black and red pigment waited beside reed pens. Each mark required precision. Grain stores had to be counted correctly. Workers needed accurate records. Deliveries had to match expectations. A careless number today might become a serious problem weeks later. Their hands grew tired in a different way than the farmers' hands. Their backs stiffened from long hours sitting. Their eyes narrowed while following neat rows of symbols. Their work left few visible muscles aching, yet required endless patience. Outside, the sun climbed higher. Shadows slowly shortened. The pleasant coolness of dawn quietly disappeared. Soon the true heat of the day would settle across every village, workshop, field, and riverbank alike. Even then, the work would continue, carried forward by people who rarely imagined that thousands of years later anyone would remember their ordinary morning at all. Yet it was mornings exactly like this, repeated again and again across generations, that slowly built one of history's greatest civilizations. And as the warm wind moved softly over the river, carrying with it the scent of reeds, wet earth, fresh bread, and distant wood smoke, another peaceful day in ancient Egypt continued almost unnoticed, just as countless days had before it. The morning settled fully over the valley, and the gentle coolness that had lingered before sunrise slowly gave way to warmth. Light spread across the river until every small ripple caught the sun for just a moment before slipping away. The Nile continued its quiet journey north, asking nothing from those who lived beside it, while offering them the steady gift of another ordinary day. The sounds of the village blended together without hurry. A hand mill turned slowly as grain was ground into flour. Sandals brushed across dusty paths, wooden doors opened and closed with soft creaks that had become familiar through many seasons. Somewhere a child laughed for only a moment before being gently called back to a simple task. A flock of ducks wandered toward the water, watched carefully by a young girl who carried a thin reed stick more for guidance than for command. Life rarely moved quickly here. The rhythm of the land encouraged patience. There was little reason to rush when the work before you would still be waiting a few moments later. Every family knew that steady hands accomplished more than hurried ones beneath the heavy Egyptian sun. Along one narrow lane, a baker was already shaping another round of dough. His hands moved with quiet confidence. He did not need to think about each motion. Years of repetition had taught his fingers exactly how much pressure to use, exactly when the dough had become smooth enough, and exactly how long it should rest before meeting the warm walls of the oven. The smell of baking bread drifted through nearby homes. It mixed with the scent of dry reeds, warm clay, smoke from cooking fires, and the faint sweetness of dates stored in woven baskets. These simple smells greeted people almost every morning. For a child growing up in the village, they became part of memory long before the child understood what memory truly was. Nearby, an elderly woman sat outside her home beneath the narrow shade of a woven awning. Her hands were busy with flax fibers that would soon become linen thread. She worked without haste, twisting and smoothing each strand with practiced care. Her back was bent from many years of labor. Fine lines rested around her eyes. Yet her movements remained graceful because they had been repeated thousands upon thousands of times. Children often gathered nearby while she worked. Sometimes she told quiet stories about seasons long past. Sometimes she spoke of unusual floods or years when the harvest had been especially generous. Other mornings she simply hummed softly to herself while birds called from the rooftops. There was comfort in familiar sounds. Across the village, a young mother carefully washed clay bowls with water carried from the river before sunrise. She used only as much water as necessary, knowing every drop had value. The bowls were simple, their surfaces marked by tiny imperfections left by the potter's hands. No one expected perfect symmetry. A bowl only needed to hold food. Its beauty came from faithful service rather than flawless appearance. Inside another home, a small boy sat beside his father, watching him repair a wooden handle that had cracked during yesterday's work. The father did not rush through the repair. He slowly scraped away rough splinters with a copper blade before smoothing the wood with sandstone. The boy watched every movement. Occasionally he reached forward to hold the tool while his father adjusted the binding. Neither spoke very much. The lesson rested in quiet observation. The boy would remember the rhythm of these careful hands long after he forgot the few words exchanged that morning. Outside the village, the fields shimmered beneath strengthening sunlight. Farmers moved through rows of young crops with measured steps. Some carried baskets filled with seed. Others cleared small weeds before they could steal precious water from the growing plants. The work appeared simple. Yet every small action protected the harvest still many weeks away. A neglected field quietly remembered every careless day. The earth noticed patience. The earth also noticed neglect. Along the irrigation channels, men used wooden shaduffs to lift river water toward higher ground. Each device balanced a long wooden pole upon a sturdy support. A bucket hung from one end while a heavy counterweight rested upon the other. The motion became almost musical. Lower. Fill. Lift. Pour. Again. Lower. Fill. Lift. Pour. The movement repeated hour after hour. Shoulders grew tired. Hands hardened. Feet settled into damp soil. Yet the steady rhythm carried water across fields that otherwise would have remained dry beneath the desert sky. Every lifted bucket became part of something much larger. No single bucket transformed the land. Thousands did. Nearby, birds landed among the reeds before lifting again into the bright air. Dragonflies hovered above still pools where frogs rested quietly in the shade. Tiny fish darted between waving plants beneath the water's surface. The river supported countless lives, large and small, each following its own quiet routine. A fisherman standing in his narrow boat watched the current carefully. He understood places where fish preferred deeper water. He noticed subtle changes in the movement of reeds. He listened to birds that often revealed where fish gathered beneath them. Knowledge like this could not be written easily upon papyrus. It lived inside long experience. Each morning added another small lesson. Each season quietly refined what had already been learned. By late morning, sunlight reflected brightly from white limestone blocks waiting beside a construction site farther from the village. Here another group of workers continued their patient labor. Some hauled stone using thick ropes and wooden sledges. Others chipped rough edges into smoother surfaces. Dust floated gently through the warm air, settling upon shoulders, hair, and sandals until nearly everything shared the same pale color. Voices remained calm. Instructions were short. There was little wasted conversation because everyone understood today's responsibilities. Water carriers moved carefully among the workers. Their clay jars felt heavier with every journey beneath the growing heat. A cool drink became more valuable as the sun climbed higher overhead. When workers paused briefly beneath simple shades made from woven reeds, nobody hurried to stand again. The short moments of rest were accepted without guilt. Bodies needed care if they were to continue tomorrow. An aching shoulder ignored today might become useless next week. Experience had taught these lessons many times before. Some workers quietly stretched tired backs. Others rubbed sore hands before returning to ropes and stone. A few simply closed their eyes for several slow breaths while warm wind drifted across the worksite. There was no shame in fatigue. The labor was honest. Its weight belonged to everyone. Not far away, in a shaded workshop, a potter sat before a spinning wheel. His foot kept the wheel turning while wet clay rose steadily between patient hands. A simple lump slowly became a jar. The walls grew thinner. The opening widened. The shape settled into quiet balance. Watching the process almost felt like watching water find its own path. Nothing seemed forced. Years of practice allowed each movement to flow naturally into the next. Nearby, rows of finished pots waited patiently for the sun to dry them before firing. Some would carry grain. Others would store oil. Some would hold fresh water drawn from the Nile. Many would survive only a few years before cracking or breaking. Others, buried beneath sand long after their owners were gone, would rest quietly for thousands of years. Yet the potter thought only of today's work. Tomorrow would bring more clay, more wheels, more jars. The ordinary routine continued. Farther along the village paths, merchants arranged simple goods beneath woven coverings that softened the bright sunlight. Bundles of onions rested beside baskets of lentils. Fresh herbs released gentle scents into the warm air. Fish caught earlier that morning lay carefully upon damp reeds to keep them cool for as long as possible. People stopped only briefly. Small exchanges required little discussion because neighbors already knew one another well. Trust had grown slowly over many years. Faces became as familiar as the streets themselves. A woman traded woven cloth for grain. A farmer exchanged onions for pottery. Another carried home fresh fish wrapped inside broad leaves. Coins played little part in many of these ordinary moments. Value often moved through simple exchange. Each family gave what they had worked to produce. Each received what another family had patiently made. In this quiet way, the village supported itself. No household truly stood alone. As midday approached, shadows gathered beneath walls while open ground shimmered beneath waves of rising heat. Even the animals searched for cooler places. Dogs rested beneath carts. Goats settled against shaded walls. Birds became quieter than they had been at sunrise. The wind itself seemed slower. The air grew heavy. Workers felt the heat pressing gently against shoulders already tired from the morning's labor. Yet no one appeared surprised. This was simply another day beneath the Egyptian sun. It had always been this way. It would likely remain this way long after today's children became old themselves. A young scribe paused from his writing to flex stiff fingers. Tiny drops of ink stained his hand. The papyrus before him listed grain deliveries from several nearby villages. Each careful mark represented baskets carried, fields harvested, and families whose daily work would never appear upon monuments. Still, their efforts mattered deeply. Without them, no record would exist. Without them, no stores of grain could be measured. Without them, no workers could be supplied. The quiet rhythm of ordinary life reached into every corner of the civilization. Some people shaped stone. Some shaped bread. Some shaped clay. Some shaped words. Together they shaped a nation without ever meeting most of the people whose lives depended upon their own. The afternoon still stretched ahead, carrying with it more work, more dust, more warm winds, and the steady comfort of familiar routines that had quietly carried generations through one peaceful day after another beside the timeless waters of the Nile. As the sun continued its slow climb across the wide Egyptian sky, the warmth settled over the land like a familiar blanket. It was not sudden. It arrived little by little, until every stone, every wall of dried mud brick, and every narrow footpath seemed to hold the day's heat within them. The village did not resist it. People adjusted their pace as they always had. Long experience had taught them that the desert rewarded steady effort more than hurried movement. A person who rushed through the morning often found the afternoon much longer than expected. The fields shimmered gently beneath the bright light. Small channels carried cool river water through carefully shaped banks of earth. The water moved quietly, never in a hurry, finding its own path toward waiting crops. Tiny ripples reflected pieces of the sky while dragonflies drifted above them, their delicate wings catching flashes of sunlight. A young farmer knelt beside one of these channels. With patient hands, he pressed damp soil into a place where the water had begun to escape. It was not difficult work, but it demanded attention. A small leak left unnoticed today could become a larger problem tomorrow. He smoothed the earth with the palm of his hand. Then he watched. The water obeyed its familiar course once again. Satisfied, he rose slowly, brushing fine dust from his linen garment before returning to the field. No one praised this small repair. No one recorded it. Yet hundreds of quiet moments just like this protected the harvest that would feed countless families many months later. The strength of a civilization often rested upon work that almost no one noticed. Along another field, women gathered bundles of flax. Their fingers moved gently among the long stems, tying neat bundles with strips of woven fiber. They worked beside one another in easy silence, speaking only now and then. Their conversation drifted softly through the warm air. They spoke about children who had begun helping with chores. They wondered whether the river might rise a little higher during the coming flood. They remembered relatives from nearby villages whom they hoped to visit after the harvest. The subjects changed slowly, much like the work itself. Nothing needed to be hurried. The bundles slowly grew into neat rows. Nearby, a little girl carefully collected fallen stalks that had been left behind. Her basket was almost as large as she was. Every few minutes she stopped to push a loose strand of dark hair away from her face before continuing her small but important task. She did not think of herself as helping to build a kingdom. She was simply helping her family. That was enough. Closer to the river, fishermen returned from deeper water with modest catches resting inside woven baskets. The fish glistened in the afternoon light. Some would be eaten before sunset. Others would be dried with salt so they could last through the days ahead. The fishermen pulled their boats gently onto the muddy bank. The wood creaked softly as it settled against the shore. One by one, the nets were lifted from the boats. The work was not yet finished. Each net needed careful inspection. Tiny tears had appeared where rough branches beneath the water had caught the woven fibers. The repairs began immediately. Strong hands moved patiently through the tangled cords. A missed knot today could become a lost meal tomorrow. Nearby, a young boy watched every movement. His father guided his fingers toward the broken place without speaking much. The lesson belonged more to the hands than to the voice. The boy copied the careful motion. His first knot was clumsy. His father smiled gently and untied it without criticism. Together they tried again. The second knot held more firmly. Nothing more needed to be said. In this quiet way, knowledge traveled from one generation to the next. Not through grand speeches. Not through written scrolls. But through ordinary afternoons beside the Nile. Farther inland, the dusty road between villages carried travelers at an unhurried pace. A merchant walked beside two donkeys carrying baskets filled with pottery, dried herbs, and folded linen cloth. The animals knew the road almost as well as the man. Their steady footsteps raised small clouds of dust that drifted briefly before settling once again. Every few miles the merchant paused beneath the shade of an acacia tree. He loosened the straps resting across the donkeys' backs. He offered them water. Then he drank quietly from his own clay jar. The silence around him was complete except for the soft wind moving through distant palms. He had traveled this road many times before. Every bend was familiar. Every resting place carried memories of previous journeys. There was comfort in returning to paths already known. The same comfort could be found in the workshops where skilled hands continued their patient labor. Inside one shaded building, carpenters worked with wood brought from distant lands along the river. Good timber was precious. Nothing was wasted. Even small pieces found new purpose. The scent of fresh cut wood mixed with dry sawdust and warm air. Copper blades scraped gently across smooth surfaces. Wooden pegs were tapped carefully into place with rounded mallets. Each sound blended into a slow rhythm that filled the workshop without disturbing its peaceful atmosphere. An apprentice swept curled wood shavings into neat piles. He watched the older craftsmen closely. Every careful cut taught him something. Not because anyone announced a lesson. Simply because patient observation revealed the proper way. Across the room, another craftsman carved the curved leg of a simple stool. He paused often. Not because he was uncertain. But because careful work welcomed quiet pauses. The wood itself seemed to ask for patience. It revealed its shape gradually beneath the blade. To hurry would only spoil what many hours had already begun. Outside, the afternoon heat deepened. The streets became quieter. People moved more slowly beneath the brilliant sky. Children who had spent the morning helping their families now rested in patches of shade. Some leaned against cool mud-brick walls. Others sat beside grandparents who quietly told stories while weaving baskets from fresh reeds. The stories were familiar. Children had heard many of them before. Yet familiar stories often brought the greatest comfort. They flowed gently from memory like the river itself. Some spoke of unusual floods remembered many years ago. Others described particularly rich harvests or seasons when birds seemed more plentiful than anyone could recall. These memories tied one generation to another. The children listened without interruption. Not because they were instructed to remain quiet, but because the slow voices invited listening. The village seemed wrapped in a peaceful stillness. Even the dogs slept. Cats stretched lazily beneath shaded doorways. Goats chewed patiently beside woven fences. Above them all, swallows circled effortlessly through the bright afternoon sky before disappearing toward the river. Inside a modest home, a woman prepared the evening meal long before sunset. She measured grain into a stone grinder. The heavy upper stone turned slowly beneath practiced hands. The gentle grinding sound filled the room. Flour collected little by little inside a shallow bowl. Nearby, onions rested beside fresh herbs gathered earlier that morning. A clay pot waited for water. Nothing about the meal was elaborate. Yet every ingredient represented many hours of quiet work. The grain had been planted months before. The onions had grown beneath careful watering. The herbs had been gathered at just the right time. The clay pot itself had once rested upon a potter's wheel. Even the firewood stacked beside the doorway had required someone to search patiently for fallen branches. Simple meals often carried invisible stories. Each bite connected many different hands. As the afternoon slowly drifted onward, the scribes continued recording the life of the land. One carefully counted sacks of grain entering a storehouse. Another copied tax records onto fresh papyrus. A younger scribe practiced writing familiar signs over and over again. His reed pen moved slowly. Sometimes the lines leaned too far. Sometimes the ink spread unevenly across the surface. Each mistake became another lesson. The older scribe sitting beside him offered only small corrections. There was no impatience. Skill arrived one careful mark at a time. Outside the open doorway, warm wind stirred the edge of the papyrus sheets. Dust floated quietly through shafts of sunlight before settling again upon the floor. The world seemed content to move at its own gentle pace. No one could have guessed that thousands of years later, people would search these same records, trying to understand lives that once seemed too ordinary to remember. Yet it was these ordinary lives that held everything together. Not just the great monuments rising in the distance. Not just the temples or palaces. But the baker rising before dawn. The fisherman repairing his net. The child carrying water. The potter shaping another jar. The farmer mending a leaking canal. The scribe patiently counting grain. The mother preparing bread before sunset. Each quiet task became another small thread woven into the fabric of a civilization. The people themselves may never have spoken of greatness. Most likely, they simply hoped for enough food, healthy children, peaceful evenings, and another sunrise beside the river. Those hopes were humble. They were shared by nearly everyone. And because they were shared, villages endured. Fields remained fertile. Workshops stayed busy. Boats continued to glide across calm water. Families gathered each evening beneath cooling skies. The civilization grew not through moments of glory, but through countless ordinary days that looked very much like this one. As the sun began its slow journey toward the western desert, its bright light softened almost imperceptibly. The shadows lengthened across the dusty paths, and the first gentle hints of evening quietly approached, bringing with them a welcome promise of cooler air, slower footsteps, and the peaceful silence that would once again settle over the timeless banks of the Nile. The afternoon slowly loosened its grip upon the land. The bright white light that had covered the valley for so many hours began to soften, almost too gently to notice. The sun had not yet reached the western hills, but its warmth no longer pressed quite so heavily upon every shoulder. A light breeze wandered across the river, carrying with it the cool scent of water and green reeds before drifting through the narrow streets of the village. People noticed the change without speaking about it. Their bodies had learned to feel the passing of the day long before clocks or calendars measured such things. The changing light, the direction of the wind, the songs of birds returning toward the riverbanks, these were the quiet signs that guided ordinary life. In the fields, farmers paused for only a moment. They stood upright, stretching backs that had remained bent for much of the day. Hands roughened by years of work rested upon wooden hoes while tired eyes looked across rows of growing grain. The fields appeared peaceful. Nothing moved except the gentle wind brushing over the young plants. Yet every stalk represented many weeks of careful attention. The earth never hurried. Seeds disappeared beneath the soil without promise. Then, after many patient days, tiny green shoots quietly greeted the morning light. The people who worked these fields understood that almost everything important required waiting. One elderly farmer removed his simple linen head covering and wiped the sweat from his brow. His hair had become almost completely white. Deep lines marked his face. The sun had touched his skin through countless harvests. He had seen the Nile rise and fall more times than he could easily remember. Many seasons had passed beneath his careful watch. He could no longer lift the heaviest baskets, yet younger workers often glanced toward him before making important decisions. His wisdom had been earned slowly. Not through unusual adventures, but through thousands of ordinary mornings. He knew which patches of ground held moisture longest after the flood. He remembered where hidden stones rested beneath the soil. He could recognize the scent of rain carried upon distant winds, even when the sky remained clear. His knowledge belonged to the land itself. Nearby, two brothers gathered bundles of reeds cut earlier in the day. The younger brother carried smaller bundles. The older one smiled quietly whenever the younger struggled beneath the weight. Without saying much, he lifted part of the load onto his own shoulder. Neither spoke. The gesture itself was enough. Family life often unfolded this way. Many acts of kindness arrived without announcement. No one expected praise. Helping simply belonged to the rhythm of living together. Closer to the village, women returned from the river with clay jars balanced carefully upon their heads. Their footsteps were steady. Years of practice allowed them to walk across uneven ground without spilling more than a few drops. The water inside the jars remained wonderfully cool. Tiny beads of moisture gathered along the outside of the clay where the afternoon breeze touched it. Children hurried to greet them. Some reached eagerly for smaller jars they were now old enough to carry themselves. Others simply walked beside their mothers, telling quiet stories about the day's small discoveries. One little boy proudly described finding a smooth stone shaped almost like the shell of a turtle. His mother smiled as she listened. The stone itself mattered very little. The joy of finding it mattered much more. They carried both the water and the story home together. Near the center of the village, smoke began rising once again from cooking fires. Small flames awakened beneath clay ovens. Dry bundles of reeds crackled softly as they caught fire. The smell of smoke drifted through narrow lanes before blending with the comforting scent of fresh bread. Soon onions were being sliced. Lentils simmered gently inside blackened pots. Flat loaves rested against the warm walls of ovens, slowly baking until their crusts turned golden. The evening meal was beginning long before darkness arrived. Food required patience. The finest bread could not be hurried. The richest stew became better when left quietly over gentle heat. Women moved through these familiar tasks almost without thinking. Hands measured grain. Wooden spoons stirred clay pots. Children were given simple chores suited to their age. One washed vegetables. Another gathered dry firewood stacked beneath an awning. An older daughter kneaded dough while her younger sister brushed flour from the low table. The work belonged to everyone. No task seemed too small. No contribution was unimportant. At the edge of the village, potters carefully examined the vessels that had spent the day drying beneath the sun. One by one, they lifted each jar. They tapped gently along the sides with practiced fingers. A clear sound meant the clay had dried evenly. A dull sound suggested hidden moisture remained inside. Those jars would wait another day before entering the kiln. Patience again revealed its quiet importance. A hurried firing could ruin hours of careful work. The potter accepted the delay without disappointment. Tomorrow would come soon enough. Inside the workshop, finished jars stood in long rows. Some were tall enough to store grain for many months. Others were no larger than a person's hand. Each carried slight differences. No two were perfectly alike. The gentle pressure of human hands had left tiny marks upon every surface. Those marks would remain long after the potter himself had grown old. Not far away, a weaver sat before a simple wooden loom. Long strands of linen stretched tightly before her. She guided the threads with calm precision. Back and forth. Again. Back and forth. The rhythm became almost hypnotic. The wooden frame gave a quiet click with every pass. Soft fibers slowly became cloth. The work demanded attention but welcomed peaceful thoughts. Many weavers quietly reflected upon family, seasons, or simple hopes while their hands continued moving almost by themselves. Outside the open doorway, warm light spilled across the dusty ground. The breeze carried the scent of fresh linen mixed with sun-warmed clay. A young apprentice watched closely. She had only recently begun learning. Her own weaving remained uneven. Some rows sat too tightly together. Others left tiny gaps. But she did not become discouraged. Everyone had once begun this same journey. Skill arrived quietly. One patient afternoon after another. As shadows lengthened, fishermen returned once more to inspect the day's catch. Some fish had already been cleaned and salted. Others rested inside cool baskets lined with damp reeds. The day's work was nearly complete, but careful preparation for tomorrow had already begun. Nets were folded neatly. Wooden oars leaned against simple shelters. Boats were pulled a little farther onto the shore where the river would not carry them away during the night. Every evening quietly prepared for another morning. Across the village, animals also settled into familiar routines. Goats wandered toward their pens without much encouragement. Donkeys stood patiently while heavy packs were removed from their backs. Chickens searched the dusty ground for a few final seeds before hopping onto low wooden perches. Cats stretched lazily before choosing warm places to rest for the coming night. Even they seemed to understand the peaceful rhythm of evening. The village itself became softer. Voices lowered naturally. The busiest hours had passed. Children who had run through dusty lanes during the afternoon now sat quietly beside parents or grandparents. Some listened to stories. Others simply watched the changing colors of the sky. The western horizon slowly shifted from bright gold to deeper shades of amber. Palm trees became dark silhouettes against the fading light. The river reflected every color with gentle patience. It had watched this same sunset for countless generations. It would continue watching long after these families were gone. A scribe carefully rolled the final papyrus sheet of the day. He cleaned his reed pen. The small cakes of ink were covered to keep them from drying. He stretched his stiff shoulders before stepping outside. For the first time in many hours, he simply stood still. The evening breeze touched his face. The sounds of the village drifted toward him. The laughter of children. The distant lowing of cattle. The quiet splash of water against boats. The gentle crackling of cooking fires. None of these sounds were remarkable by themselves. Together they formed the heartbeat of the civilization he quietly served. As daylight continued to fade, families gradually gathered for the evening meal. Simple bread was broken by hand. Bowls of lentils passed from one person to another. Fresh onions, herbs, dates, and small pieces of fish completed the modest feast. The conversation remained gentle. People spoke about the day's work. A repaired irrigation channel. A healthy calf. A neighbor who had shared extra grain. A child who had learned a new task. No one needed grand stories. Ordinary life provided enough to talk about. Above them, the first evening stars began appearing one by one in the deepening sky. The heat slowly slipped away into the desert. The air grew cooler. The village breathed more easily. The day's labor had ended, but its quiet rewards remained all around them, in the bread upon the table, the water in the jars, the repaired tools beside the doorway, the harvested reeds, the woven cloth, the written records, and the peaceful feeling that tomorrow, like today, would begin again beside the gentle waters of the Nile. The evening settled over the Nile with the quiet certainty of something that had happened countless times before. The last warmth of the sun lingered upon the mudbrick walls, slowly fading as shadows stretched across the village. The bright colors of the day softened into gentle shades of gold, amber, and deep blue. Along the western horizon, the desert hills stood silently, their edges becoming smooth against the growing darkness. A cool breeze wandered over the river. It carried the scent of fresh water, damp reeds, and rich black soil left behind by the flood seasons. The breeze slipped through open doorways and narrow lanes, easing the heat that had rested upon the land since morning. People welcomed it without saying a word. After many hours beneath the sun, the evening air felt almost like a quiet gift. Families remained gathered outside their homes while there was still enough light to see one another's faces. The day's work had finally slowed to a peaceful stop, and no one seemed eager to hurry into sleep. There was comfort in these gentle hours. Children sat close to their parents, still awake but no longer filled with the restless energy of the afternoon. Dust clung to their sandals and to the edges of their linen clothes. Their hair carried tiny grains of sand that sparkled whenever the last sunlight touched them. One small girl leaned against her grandmother's shoulder. The older woman slowly braided the child's dark hair while speaking in a voice so soft that only those nearest could hear. She spoke of the river. Not of great floods or famous years, but of ordinary mornings when mist floated above the water before sunrise. She remembered watching white birds stand perfectly still among the reeds while fishermen quietly pushed their boats into the current. The child listened with heavy eyes. She had seen these same sights herself many times. Yet hearing them described by someone who had lived through many more seasons gave them a different kind of beauty. Nearby, a grandfather sat upon a low wooden stool, carefully repairing a woven basket whose handle had begun to loosen. His fingers moved more slowly than they had when he was young. The reeds bent beneath his hands with gentle resistance. He examined every strand before tightening it into place. Nothing about the repair was hurried. The basket had served the family for many years. With a little care, it would continue serving them for many more. Around him, several children watched with quiet curiosity. One reached forward to hand him another strip of reed. The old man smiled. He nodded his thanks. No lesson was announced. The children simply watched patience become visible. Across the village, cooking fires glowed warmly beneath clay ovens. The flames were no longer bright. Instead, they burned low and steady, providing just enough heat for the evening meal. The smell of warm bread drifted gently through the streets. Clay pots simmered quietly. Steam rose into the cool air carrying the comforting scent of lentils, onions, herbs, and freshly baked grain. Simple meals often tasted richest after a long day of honest work. Hands that had carried heavy baskets or lifted water throughout the afternoon welcomed every piece of bread with quiet gratitude. One family sat together upon woven mats spread across the packed earth outside their home. The father tore a loaf into several pieces before passing it around. The youngest child accepted hers with both hands. Her older brother dipped bread into a clay bowl filled with soft lentils. No one ate quickly. Conversation moved gently between mouthfuls. Someone mentioned seeing unusually large fish near the reeds. Another wondered if tomorrow might bring slightly cooler weather. The grandmother reminded everyone that the flax bundles would need turning after sunrise. Their words rose and faded naturally, blending with the sounds of neighboring families sharing similar evenings. No home was completely silent. Yet no home was noisy. The village breathed together. Farther from the houses, cattle rested inside simple enclosures built from wooden posts and woven fencing. The animals had spent the day grazing or helping with field work. Now they stood quietly, chewing slowly beneath the evening sky. A young boy carried fresh water to them in two small clay jars suspended from a wooden yoke across his shoulders. The jars were heavy. He paused once before reaching the enclosure. His father noticed. Without speaking, he stepped forward and lifted one of the jars. Together they walked the remaining distance. The work became lighter simply because it was shared. Nearby, a donkey lowered its head into a feeding trough filled with chopped reeds. Its ears twitched now and then as insects drifted through the cooling air. The animal had walked many dusty roads that day, carrying grain and pottery between neighboring villages. Tomorrow would bring another journey. Tonight, however, there was only quiet rest. Along the riverbank, fishermen remained for a little while longer. They sat beside overturned boats while inspecting the day's repaired nets one final time. The fading light made the tiny knots more difficult to see. Still, experienced fingers found each repaired place without much effort. One fisherman ran his hand slowly across the woven fibers. He smiled with quiet satisfaction. The net would serve another season. Beside him, another man cleaned his wooden oar. The smooth handle bore the marks of many years. The wood had darkened where countless hands had gripped it. Tiny scratches covered its surface. Each mark carried the memory of another ordinary journey across the Nile. The river itself had grown calmer. The day's small waves settled into long gentle ripples. Water reflected the first bright stars appearing overhead. Occasionally a fish disturbed the surface with a quiet splash before disappearing once again beneath the dark water. Reeds whispered softly whenever the evening breeze passed through them. The sound was so gentle that it almost blended into silence. A pair of white birds landed near the shoreline. They folded their wings carefully before standing motionless in the shallow water. For several long moments, nothing moved except the slow current flowing around their thin legs. The Nile welcomed stillness. It had always done so. Back in the village, oil lamps began appearing one by one. Small flames flickered inside simple clay holders. Their light reached only a short distance, leaving soft shadows dancing upon nearby walls. Inside each home, the warm glow transformed familiar rooms into peaceful places. Clay jars cast long shadows. Woven baskets rested quietly in corners. Sleeping mats were unrolled across smooth floors. The day's tools were placed neatly beside doorways where they would be easy to find before dawn. Nothing was left carelessly scattered. Order made tomorrow's work a little easier. A mother gently shook dust from a woven blanket before spreading it across the floor. Nearby, her youngest son struggled to keep his eyes open. He had spent much of the afternoon carrying kindling for the cooking fire. It had been only a small responsibility. Still, to a child, even small responsibilities could leave pleasant tiredness. He leaned against his mother's side. She smiled softly before brushing a little dust from his cheek. Outside, voices gradually became fewer. Families wished one another peaceful nights. Doorways grew quieter. The narrow street slowly emptied. The village that had awakened before sunrise with steady purpose now settled into deep rest. Even the workshops became silent. The potter covered the remaining clay with damp cloth so it would stay soft until morning. The carpenter placed his copper tools inside a wooden chest. The weaver folded unfinished linen carefully across the loom. Each craft paused where it stood. Nothing truly ended. The work simply waited for another dawn. Above the valley, the night sky deepened into rich darkness. Without the bright light of the sun, countless stars appeared across the heavens. They reflected softly upon the Nile, creating the gentle illusion that the river carried pieces of the sky upon its surface. Many people looked upward before returning indoors. The stars were familiar companions. They had watched over their parents. They had watched over their grandparents. They would quietly watch over children yet to be born. The steady rhythm of the heavens reminded everyone that life moved in gentle cycles. Morning followed night. Flood followed drought. Planting followed harvest. Rest followed labor. Each season returned in its own time. There was comfort in knowing that tomorrow did not need to be invented. It would arrive just as today had arrived. Slowly. Quietly. With the first cool breeze before dawn and the soft murmur of the Nile flowing through the darkness. As one by one the oil lamps were gently extinguished, the village surrendered itself to sleep. Only the quiet river remained awake, moving steadily beneath the stars, carrying with it the silent promise of another ordinary day waiting just beyond the horizon. Night rested gently over the valley. The village had become quiet enough that the smallest sounds seemed to travel much farther than they had during the busy hours of daylight. The gentle murmur of the Nile drifted through the darkness like a familiar song that no one had ever needed to learn. It had always been there, flowing patiently through the lives of countless generations. The river did not sleep. While families rested behind thick mudbrick walls, the current continued its slow journey beneath the stars. Moonlight rested upon the surface of the water, breaking into silver fragments whenever the current slipped around reeds or shallow banks. A cool breeze crossed the valley. It touched the palm trees first, stirring their long leaves until they whispered softly together. It wandered through the gardens beside the homes, carrying the faint scent of herbs that had gathered the warmth of the day. Finally it reached the village itself, slipping through open doorways and small windows where families slept peacefully. Inside one home, the day's final warmth still lingered in the walls. A father rested upon a woven reed mat beside his wife and children. Their blankets were simple linen cloths, light enough for the warm season. A small clay lamp had already burned low before being gently covered, leaving only darkness inside the room. The silence was comforting. Every familiar object remained where it had been placed before sleep. The water jars stood against the wall. The baskets rested beside the doorway. The wooden hoe leaned quietly in its corner, waiting for another morning. Nothing demanded attention. For a few precious hours, the tools of labor could simply remain still. Outside, a village dog slowly wandered through the empty lanes. Its paws made almost no sound upon the packed earth. It paused now and then, lifting its nose toward the breeze before continuing its gentle walk. There was nothing unusual to discover. Every scent belonged to neighbors, familiar animals, warm bread, cooling ashes, and the rich soil that surrounded the village. The dog eventually settled beneath a cart whose wooden wheels still held the dust of the day's journey. There it curled into itself and closed its eyes. Even the animals understood the comfort of routine. Farther away, near the edge of the fields, a watchman remained awake. His task was not dramatic. Most nights passed without interruption. Still, someone always remained nearby, listening for wandering animals that might damage young crops or disturb stored grain. He leaned lightly upon a wooden staff while looking across the moonlit fields. The irrigation channels reflected narrow ribbons of silver beneath the moon. The growing grain moved gently whenever the breeze reached it. Nothing else stirred. The watchman was grateful for such quiet nights. Peace itself required very little effort. It simply asked people to care for one another and for the land that sustained them. After some time, he sat upon a smooth stone near the edge of the field. He drank a small amount of cool water from a clay jar and listened. An owl called from somewhere among the date palms. Insects sang steadily from the reeds. Beyond them all flowed the endless voice of the Nile. These sounds had changed very little during his lifetime. His father had heard them. His grandfather had heard them. Perhaps, he sometimes wondered, their own ancestors had listened to these same sounds while watching these same stars. The thought brought him quiet comfort. The world seemed very large, yet these familiar nights made it feel close and welcoming. Along the riverbank, several fishing boats rested securely against wooden posts. Their ropes creaked softly as the current pulled against them. The boats rocked almost imperceptibly, rising and falling with slow, patient movements. Inside one of them rested a folded fishing net. The fibers still carried the scent of river water and fresh reeds. By morning, dew would settle gently upon the woven cords. The fisherman who owned the net would arrive before sunrise, shake away the moisture, and prepare for another day upon the water. For now, both boat and net enjoyed the same quiet rest as the village itself. High above, the stars filled the sky with calm brilliance. Without the bright sun to hide them, they appeared almost endless. The ancient people often looked upward during these peaceful hours. The heavens offered guidance, comfort, and a sense of order. Night after night, familiar patterns crossed the sky with steady faithfulness. There was reassurance in their constancy. The stars never hurried. They simply followed their paths. Back inside the village, a young mother stirred briefly in her sleep. Her smallest child had turned over, searching without waking for the warmth of her nearby blanket. Half asleep, she gently covered him once more before settling back onto her mat. The moment lasted only a few heartbeats. Then the room became still again. Such quiet acts of care happened every night. They were never carved into stone. No scribe carefully recorded them. Yet they were among the most important moments in the life of every family. Children who slept safely grew into adults who would one day care for others in exactly the same way. Love often revealed itself through ordinary habits. A blanket adjusted. A lamp extinguished. Fresh water left beside a sleeping place. A door checked before bedtime. Small gestures quietly repeated over many years. In another house, an elderly couple slept lightly. Age had changed their nights. They woke more easily than when they were young. Sometimes they listened together to the peaceful sounds outside before returning to sleep. The old man quietly remembered evenings from decades before when he had returned home with stronger legs and broader shoulders after working in the fields. Now younger people carried the heavier loads. He no longer felt sadness about this. It seemed natural. Life moved gently from one season into another. His knowledge remained useful even as his body slowed. Tomorrow morning he would again show his grandson how to recognize healthy grain before harvest. Some lessons could not be rushed. They belonged to time itself. Near the center of the village stood the small workshop of a potter. The kill had cooled after the day's firing. Inside, newly hardened jars rested quietly, protected by darkness. The clay still held traces of warmth. Each vessel had begun only days earlier as soft earth gathered from the riverbank. Patient hands had shaped it. The sun had dried it. Fire had strengthened it. Soon it would carry water, grain, oil, or fresh bread. Even an ordinary jar lived through its own quiet journey. Nothing in the village appeared suddenly. Everything required time. The same was true of the great civilization rising along the Nile. Its temples, storehouses, canals, and monuments did not emerge from moments of greatness alone. They grew from ordinary mornings, patient afternoons, peaceful evenings, and restful nights exactly like this one. Every sleeping farmer, every resting fisherman, every tired baker, every careful scribe, every child dreaming beside cool mudbrick walls. Together, without ever fully realizing it, they formed the steady heartbeat of a civilization that would endure for thousands of years. The night deepened. The moon slowly climbed higher above the eastern horizon before beginning its silent journey across the sky. The breeze became cooler. Palm leaves whispered once more. Somewhere in the distance, a donkey shifted quietly in its shelter before settling again. Nothing disturbed the peace. Hours passed gently. The village breathed in slow, even rhythms. The Nile continued flowing beneath the stars, carrying water from lands far to the south toward the distant sea. It had flowed before these people were born. It would continue long after they were gone. Yet for this single quiet night, the river belonged to them. Its waters nourished their fields. Its banks held their homes. Its gentle voice wrapped around their dreams like a lullaby that never truly ended. And little by little, as the darkest hours of the night began their slow passage toward dawn, the eastern horizon prepared for the faintest hint of light, a promise that another ordinary day, filled with the same patient work, familiar faces, and peaceful routines, was already waiting just beyond the edge of the sleeping world. The deepest hours of the night slowly gave way to the quiet promise of morning. Long before the first hint of sunlight reached the eastern horizon, the air across the Nile Valley felt different. The warmth stored in the earth during the previous day had almost completely slipped away, leaving behind a gentle coolness that settled over the fields and village alike. The world seemed to pause. For a little while, neither night nor day fully claimed the land. The stars still filled the sky, though a few near the eastern edge had begun to fade. Their light grew softer as an almost invisible ribbon of pale gray appeared beyond the distant desert. The river noticed the coming morning before anyone else. Its calm surface slowly changed color, shifting from deep black to muted silver. Tiny ripples carried reflections of both the remaining stars above and the first quiet light gathering beyond the horizon. Mist rose gently from the water. It drifted across the reeds in thin white ribbons, moving so slowly that it seemed almost still. A fisherman, already awake, stood beside his boat. He had risen without needing to be called. After so many years, his body knew this hour better than any voice could. He walked carefully across the cool riverbank, feeling the damp earth beneath his sandals. The air carried the fresh scent of water mixed with wet reeds and dark fertile soil. He paused before pushing the boat into the river. Not because he was in a hurry. Quite the opposite. These peaceful moments before sunrise had become his favorite part of the day. The world asked nothing of him yet. No conversations. No heavy lifting. Only silence. He rested one hand upon the smooth wooden edge of the boat and looked across the water. Somewhere far downstream another fisherman quietly prepared for his own morning. Farther away still, beyond villages hidden by the gentle curve of the river, thousands of others were waking in much the same way. None of them knew one another. Yet their mornings followed the same calm rhythm. Across the village, the first rooster greeted the coming dawn. Its call drifted across the sleeping homes before fading into the stillness. A donkey answered with a low, patient sound. Then everything became quiet again. Inside a small mud-brick house, a mother slowly opened her eyes. For a few moments she remained still beneath her linen covering. She listened. The familiar sounds of the village returning to life comforted her. The rooster. The breeze outside. The distant river. The gentle breathing of her children sleeping nearby. She smiled softly before rising. The cool floor felt pleasant beneath her feet. She wrapped a simple linen garment around herself and stepped toward the clay water jar resting against the wall. The water inside remained wonderfully cool after the night. She poured a little into a small bowl and washed the dust from her hands and face. The fresh water awakened her more gently than any loud sound ever could. Soon she lit the small clay lamp. Its tiny flame pushed back the darkness only enough to begin the day's first quiet tasks. Outside, another family had already begun grinding grain. The heavy upper stone turned slowly. Its familiar scraping sound echoed softly through the still air. Round and round it moved. Patient. Steady. Unchanging. Flour slowly gathered beneath the stone. Enough for bread. Enough for another day. Nearby, a young girl carried a bundle of dry reeds toward the cooking fire. She had performed this small task almost every morning since becoming old enough to help. The bundle felt lighter now than it once had. Not because it weighed less. Because she had grown stronger. Without realizing it, each ordinary morning had quietly shaped her. The same could be said for every child in the village. No grand ceremony marked the moment they became useful members of the community. Responsibility arrived little by little. A smaller basket one year. A larger one the next. A short walk to the river. Then a longer one. Watching older hands. Then working beside them. Finally becoming the experienced hands others would watch. The change happened so gradually that almost no one noticed. Near the edge of the village, an elderly farmer stepped outside his home. The morning air felt cool against his weathered face. He stretched slowly before looking toward the eastern sky. Its color had begun to change. Soft shades of pale blue mixed with gentle pink above the desert hills. He smiled. He had watched this sunrise thousands of times. Yet it never seemed exactly the same. Some mornings arrived beneath thin clouds. Others beneath perfectly clear skies. Sometimes birds crossed the horizon before the sun appeared. Other mornings the sky remained completely empty. Each dawn carried its own quiet personality. He bent down and picked up his wooden walking staff. Its polished surface reflected years of steady use. The wood had grown smooth where his hand naturally rested. Every mark upon it carried a memory of another ordinary day spent walking beside fields, canals, and riverbanks. Nearby, his grandson stepped outside. The boy rubbed sleep from his eyes before looking toward the brightening sky. Without speaking, the old man pointed toward a small flock of birds flying low over the fields. The child followed them with his eyes. "They know the morning well," the old man said quietly. The boy nodded. No further explanation was needed. Some lessons were best given in only a few words. The birds themselves completed the teaching. As the eastern horizon brightened, more homes awakened. Doors opened. Cooking fires were carefully stirred back to life. Thin streams of smoke rose into the calm air. The comforting smell of fresh bread slowly spread throughout the village once again. It mingled with the scent of damp earth and cool river water. These familiar aromas welcomed another day just as surely as the rising sun. At the workshops, craftsmen began uncovering the tools they had carefully stored the evening before. The potter gently lifted the damp cloth protecting yesterday's remaining clay. His fingers pressed lightly into its surface. It was still soft. Perfect. He smiled with quiet satisfaction. Today's work could begin exactly where yesterday's had ended. Nothing had been lost. The carpenter opened his wooden chest. Inside lay copper blades, wooden mallets, measuring cords, and smooth stones used for polishing. Before touching any of them, he simply stood for a moment, breathing the cool morning air drifting through the doorway. Soon enough the workshop would fill with the sounds of scraping wood and tapping pegs. For now, silence remained his companion. Across the fields, laborers gathered one by one. No loud signal called them together. No hurried footsteps disturbed the peace. People simply arrived, greeting one another with gentle smiles and quiet words. Some carried hoes. Others brought woven baskets. A few balanced water jars upon their shoulders. Every tool had its purpose. Every person had a task waiting. The first rays of sunlight finally reached the tops of the distant palm trees. Golden light slowly spilled downward, touching the reeds, the irrigation canals, the mudbrick homes, and finally the faces of those already beginning another day. The village glowed softly. Long shadows stretched across the paths before gradually shrinking as the sun climbed higher. Birdsong became louder. The river sparkled with new light. Children laughed briefly before remembering the morning chores waiting for them. Life had begun again. Not because anything extraordinary had happened, but because ordinary life never truly stopped. It rested. It breathed. Then it quietly continued. Every sunrise invited the people of the Nile to repeat familiar work with patient hands. Fields would be tended. Bread would be baked. Boats would leave the shore. Clay would become jars. Papyrus would receive fresh lines of careful writing. Children would learn by watching. Grandparents would share gentle wisdom earned through many seasons. And as the warm light spread farther across the valley, another peaceful day unfolded almost exactly like the one before it, not through dullness, but through the quiet strength of routine, the kind of routine that, day after day and generation after generation, slowly built one of the world's most enduring civilizations. The sun rose a little higher above the eastern horizon, and with its gentle climb the valley slowly awakened in full. Golden light spread across the broad waters of the Nile until the river shimmered like polished bronze. The mist that had rested over the water only moments before quietly disappeared, leaving behind clear reflections of palm trees, fishing boats, and the peaceful sky above. Morning had fully arrived. The coolness of dawn remained for a little while longer, encouraging everyone to complete the heavier work before the stronger heat settled over the land. People understood this rhythm so well that very little needed to be planned. Their bodies had learned it through years of repetition, just as their parents and grandparents had before them. Along the edge of the village, a young man placed a woven basket across his shoulder before beginning the familiar walk toward the fields. The path beneath his sandals was smooth from countless footsteps. Generations had traveled this same narrow trail. Each season added new footprints while gently erasing those that had come before. The road itself remembered everyone without keeping any single mark for very long. As he walked, the young man passed neighbors already beginning their own work. An elderly woman swept the packed earth outside her doorway with a broom made from bundled reeds. Each slow movement lifted a little dust into the morning air before the breeze carried it away. The sweeping was not only for cleanliness. It prepared the home to welcome another day. A clean doorway seemed to invite calmness inside. Nearby, a pot of fresh water stood cooling in the shade. Tiny drops of moisture formed along the outside of the clay. The vessel quietly did what it had been shaped to do, asking for nothing more than careful hands and occasional filling from the river. At another house, two sisters worked together beneath a simple woven shelter. One carefully spun flax into fine thread while the other wound the finished strands into neat bundles. Their fingers moved with remarkable steadiness. The work required attention, but not haste. The soft fibers slipped gently between their hands, becoming stronger with each careful twist. Every length of thread would one day become part of a linen garment, a blanket, or a sail carried upon the Nile. It was easy to overlook such quiet work. Yet every finished piece of cloth began exactly like this, with patient hands sitting together in the cool hours of morning. A little farther along the path, children gathered beside a shallow canal. Each carried a small clay jar. The jars were much lighter than those used by the adults, but they still required balance and care. The oldest child crossed first, stepping carefully over flat stones placed just above the flowing water. The younger ones watched closely before following. No one hurried them. Learning to move with confidence came one careful step at a time. When all the jars had been filled, the children walked home together. Some water splashed gently onto the path. No one minded. There would be many more journeys to the river before the day was done. Near the fields, the steady rhythm of work was already beginning. Farmers spread across the rich black soil, their figures moving slowly beneath the growing light. One man loosened the earth around young plants with a wooden hoe. Another examined the leaves for signs that insects had visited during the night. Two women carefully gathered weeds before they could compete with the crops for water. Every task appeared small by itself. Together they protected the harvest that would feed entire communities. The irrigation channels carried fresh river water through the fields with quiet determination. Their banks had been shaped and repaired over many years. Some sections showed fresh patches of damp earth where yesterday's work had strengthened the walls. Others were so smooth that they seemed almost natural, as though the water had always known exactly where to flow. A pair of brothers walked beside one of the channels, watching the water closely. The older brother pointed toward a small branch that had drifted into the current. Without hesitation, the younger stepped into the shallow edge of the canal. The cool water surrounded his ankles as he lifted the branch free. The current immediately returned to its gentle path. The task lasted only a few moments. Yet without such simple attention, water might have slowly gathered in the wrong place, leaving another field thirsty. The land rewarded people who noticed small things. Farther away, where the river widened slightly, fishermen guided their narrow boats into deeper water. The oars entered the river without splashing. Long practice had taught the men how to move almost silently. The boats glided between stands of tall papyrus that swayed gently with the morning breeze. Birds perched among the reeds, watching patiently. Some lifted into the air as the boats passed. Others remained perfectly still. One fisherman paused his rowing for a moment. He looked toward the eastern bank where sunlight had begun to reach the tops of the palms. The beauty of the morning required no words. He simply watched. Then he placed his oar back into the water and continued downstream. The river had become part of his life long before he could remember. As a child, he had played beside its shallow edges. Later, he had learned to untangle fishing nets while sitting beside his father. Eventually, he had guided his own boat through these same calm waters. Now, with quiet confidence, he moved as naturally across the Nile as others walked the dusty village paths. Not far from the river, the first sounds of a busy workshop drifted into the morning air. A carpenter measured a cedar plank with a length of knotted cord. The wood was valuable. Every cut had to be carefully considered before the blade touched its surface. His apprentice stood nearby, holding the board steady. The young boy watched every movement with careful attention. He noticed how the carpenter paused before each cut. He noticed how the blade was cleaned after every few strokes. He noticed how even the smallest piece of leftover wood was carefully set aside instead of thrown away. These quiet observations became lessons that no written scroll could fully capture. Across the lane, the potter's wheel had already begun turning. The circular stone moved smoothly beneath practiced feet. A lump of damp clay rested at its center. Slowly, almost magically, the shapeless earth rose beneath gentle hands. The walls of a jar grew thinner. Its mouth widened. Its sides became graceful and even. The potter did not force the clay. He guided it. The clay seemed willing to become whatever patient hands invited it to be. Nearby, rows of finished vessels stood waiting in the sunlight. Some would hold grain harvested months from now. Others would carry fresh water from the Nile before the afternoon heat arrived. A few would eventually travel far beyond the village, exchanged by merchants for goods made in distant places. Still, each vessel began here. Quietly. Without ceremony. Inside another workshop, a scribe unrolled a fresh sheet of papyrus. He carefully prepared his reed pen before dipping it into dark ink. For a moment he simply looked across the smooth surface before him. Then he began writing. Each symbol appeared slowly. His hand moved with remarkable control. There was no need for speed. Accuracy mattered far more. Outside his doorway, life continued with its familiar rhythm. Farmers tended crops. Children carried water. Goats wandered between shaded walls. Merchants arranged baskets of onions, figs, and woven cloth. The scribe recorded only a small part of this world. Yet every careful line preserved the quiet order that allowed daily life to continue. The morning unfolded with gentle certainty. No trumpet announced it. No dramatic event interrupted it. Instead, one ordinary task followed another, just as the river followed its course toward the sea. Bread baked. Fields were watered. Tools were repaired. Cloth was woven. Boats drifted across calm water. Children learned by watching older hands. The civilization did not grow because of one extraordinary day. It grew because thousands of ordinary mornings like this one blended together so seamlessly that they seemed almost timeless. And beneath the warm light of the Egyptian sun, with the scent of fresh bread, damp earth, river water, and drying clay filling the air, another peaceful morning quietly became another small stone in the unseen foundation of a civilization that would endure through the ages. The morning settled comfortably across the valley, and the gentle coolness that had welcomed the sunrise slowly began to fade. The warmth of the sun spread over the fields with quiet patience, touching the tops of the grain first, then the narrow irrigation canals, and finally the dusty paths that connected one small village to another. Nothing changed suddenly. The day unfolded one peaceful moment at a time. The Nile continued its endless journey through the heart of the land, flowing with the same calm purpose it had carried for thousands of seasons. Along its banks, reeds swayed softly in the growing breeze, their long green stems bending together before standing upright once again. A flock of white ibises lifted into the brightening sky. Their wings moved slowly, almost lazily, as they crossed above the water. Below them, the river reflected every graceful movement. For a few moments, bird and reflection seemed to glide together before the current gently carried the image away. A farmer looked up from his work just long enough to watch them disappear. Then he smiled quietly and returned to the field. There was beauty everywhere, but there was also work to be done. The two often lived side by side. His hands moved carefully through rows of young grain. Each plant received a quick glance. Healthy leaves caught the sunlight with a soft green glow. A few smaller shoots struggled where the soil had dried too quickly. The farmer knelt beside them. With a wooden tool, he gently loosened the earth around their roots before guiding a little water from the nearby channel. The water flowed slowly. He watched until the dry ground darkened. Only then did he stand again. The task had taken only a few moments. Yet those moments might mean the difference between a strong harvest and a weak one many months later. Nearby, another worker carried two woven baskets suspended from a smooth wooden pole across his shoulders. The baskets held fresh mud gathered from the edge of the canal. He walked toward a section of the irrigation bank where yesterday's water had softened the earth. Without complaint, he began rebuilding the edge by hand. He pressed damp clay firmly into place. His fingers shaped the surface until the water once again followed its proper path. When he finished, he rinsed his hands in the canal. The cool water washed away the mud, but not the satisfaction of quiet work completed well. Across another field, women harvested herbs growing along the moist edges of the irrigation channels. The leaves released gentle fragrances as they were gathered. Mint, coriander, fresh green shoots that would flavor simple meals later that evening. They worked with woven baskets resting beside them. Every few minutes they paused to brush away loose strands of hair stirred by the breeze. Their conversation remained soft. One woman remembered the unusually high flood from many years before. Another spoke about her youngest son's first successful attempt at helping grind grain. They smiled together. These ordinary conversations wove friendships as steadily as hands wove linen. Children wandered nearby, never far from the adults. A little boy crouched beside a shallow pool left behind where water had briefly overflowed the canal. Tiny fish darted through the clear water. He watched them with complete attention. Their movements were quick, almost impossible to predict. He reached toward them once, laughing quietly as they slipped away before his fingers touched the surface. His mother glanced over with a gentle smile. She knew he would soon return to helping. For a few moments, curiosity deserved its own place in the morning. Not every lesson came through work. Some arrived through careful watching. The village itself remained full of gentle movement. Outside one home, an elderly woman carefully spread damp linen across smooth stones so the morning sun could dry it. She shook each cloth gently before laying it flat. The fabric fluttered briefly in the breeze before settling. Rows of white linen slowly brightened beneath the growing light. Nearby, another woman polished a clay water jar with a smooth piece of stone. The surface gradually became cleaner, revealing the warm reddish color beneath yesterday's dust. The jar had served her family faithfully for many years. She treated it with quiet respect. Objects made by patient hands deserved patient care. Along the main path, a merchant prepared for another journey between villages. His two donkeys stood calmly while he adjusted the woven packs resting across their backs. Inside the baskets were simple goods. Clay bowls, bundles of linen, dried dates, small jars of fragrant oil. Nothing extravagant. Only the things ordinary families needed in their daily lives. The merchant checked each knot carefully. A loose rope could allow precious goods to fall during the long walk. When he finished, he rested one hand upon the neck of the nearest donkey. The animal blinked slowly in the warm morning light. Together they began their familiar journey down the dusty road. Their footsteps faded gradually into the distance. At the riverbank, boat builders inspected a small fishing vessel that had been pulled onto dry ground the previous evening. The wood had begun to dry after many days upon the water. One craftsman knelt beside the hull. With patient fingers, he rubbed fresh resin into tiny cracks between the planks. The fragrant scent of warmed resin drifted into the air. It would help keep water outside the boat where it belonged. The work demanded no great strength, only careful attention. Nearby, another man shaped a replacement oar from a straight length of wood. Each stroke of his copper blade removed only a thin curl. The growing pile of wood shavings rested at his feet like pale ribbons. The shape of the oar appeared slowly. Good tools never seemed to arrive all at once. They revealed themselves little by little. Inside the village workshops, life followed the same peaceful rhythm. The potter's wheel turned steadily. The carpenter measured twice before making each careful cut. The weaver guided linen threads through her loom with slow precision. Back and forth. Again. Back and forth. The soft wooden frame answered with its familiar rhythm. The sound blended with distant birdsong and the faint voices drifting through the open doorway. Hours passed almost unnoticed. The work itself became a gentle measure of time. A young apprentice paused for a moment to stretch his stiff shoulders. He looked outside. The sun had climbed much higher now. Shadows had grown shorter. The warmth was beginning to settle more firmly across the land. He took a slow drink from a cool clay cup before returning to his task. The older craftsman watched him with quiet approval. Learning included knowing when to rest for a moment before continuing. Even steady work needed gentle pauses. Not far away, scribes continued filling fresh sheets of papyrus. One carefully recorded the amount of grain stored inside a nearby granary. Another copied a list of workers assigned to repair a canal after the coming flood season. The scratching of reed pens across papyrus was soft and steady. Each line added another small piece to the careful order that supported life along the Nile. Most people whose names appeared in these records would never imagine that future generations might one day search for traces of their lives. They were not seeking fame. They simply wished to complete today's work honestly before returning home. That quiet purpose was enough. The morning gradually moved toward midday. The breeze became warmer. The scent of baking bread slowly gave way to the smell of sun-warmed earth and drying reeds. Workers adjusted their pace without complaint. They knew the strongest heat still lay ahead. Even so, no one seemed discouraged. The rhythm of the day remained familiar. One task finished. Another began. Water was carried. Stone was lifted. Grain was tended. Fish were caught. Children learned. Parents guided. Grandparents remembered. The village breathed together in one long, peaceful rhythm, each ordinary action joining countless others to create a life that was both humble and enduring. And beneath the ever-brightening Egyptian sky, with the Nile flowing faithfully beside them, another morning quietly became another page in the endless story of ordinary people whose steady routines would shape one of history's greatest civilizations without ever asking to be remembered. The sun continued its patient climb across the wide Egyptian sky. By now the morning had gently crossed into the first hours before midday. The shadows that had stretched long across the village at dawn had become short and neat, gathering close to walls, baskets, and the feet of those still working in the fields. The air had grown warmer, though the river still offered moments of coolness whenever the breeze wandered inland. No one seemed surprised by the change. Every day followed this familiar path. The cool hours invited steady labor. The warm hours encouraged slower movements. The evening would eventually offer rest. This quiet rhythm had become part of every person's life, so deeply understood that it rarely needed to be spoken aloud. Along the riverbank, a young fisherman carefully drew in his net. He did not pull with sudden force. Instead, he worked slowly, allowing the water to slip through the woven fibers before lifting them into the boat. Droplets sparkled in the sunlight as they fell back into the Nile. Several silver fish glimmered among the cords. They moved gently, catching flashes of light before settling into the basket at the bottom of the boat. The fisherman looked over his catch with quiet satisfaction. It was enough. Enough for his family. Enough to trade for grain and vegetables. Enough to begin another ordinary day without worry. He never expected every net to be full. The river offered what it could. Patience had taught him to accept both plentiful mornings and modest ones with the same calm heart. As he folded the damp net beside him, he ran his fingers across the knots. Each knot held a memory. Some had been tied by his father many years earlier. Others he had repaired himself only a few evenings before. The net was more than a tool. It carried the quiet history of many careful hands. Farther inland, the fields shimmered beneath the strengthening sunlight. A pair of oxen moved steadily along the edge of a cultivated plot. Their broad shoulders leaned gently into the wooden yoke as they pulled a simple plow through the dark soil. The farmer guiding them spoke only occasionally. The animals already knew the familiar pace. Step by step they crossed the field. At the end of each row, they turned together before beginning another slow journey across the earth. The rich soil rolled gently behind the blade. Tiny birds followed close behind, searching for insects uncovered by the fresh furrows. The farmer smiled as he watched them. The birds had become reliable companions over the years. Whenever the plow moved, they appeared. Whenever the work ended, they quietly disappeared once again. Nature itself seemed to understand the daily routines of the people. Nearby, a woman carried a wide woven basket filled with fresh vegetables gathered from a small garden near her home. Green onions rested beside leafy herbs. A few cucumbers lay carefully along one side. She paused beneath the shade of a date palm before continuing toward the village. The shade lasted only a few moments. Still, those moments were welcome. She adjusted the basket upon her shoulder before continuing with the same calm pace. Children passed her on the path carrying much smaller baskets of their own. One little girl proudly balanced several freshly baked loaves wrapped in linen cloth. The bread was still warm. Its comforting aroma drifted through the morning air. As she walked, she held the bundle carefully with both hands. She understood that the bread represented many hours of work. Someone had planted the grain. Someone had harvested it. Someone had ground it into flour. Someone had kneaded the dough before sunrise. Her task was simply to carry it home safely. Every small responsibility connected to many others. At the center of the village, the marketplace slowly grew livelier. There were no loud voices calling for attention. People already knew one another well. Neighbors greeted neighbors with warm smiles and gentle words. A merchant arranged neat rows of clay bowls upon a woven mat. Beside him, another displayed small jars filled with fragrant oils. Their scents drifted softly into the warm air. A nearby basket overflowed with ripe dates whose deep brown skins shone gently in the sunlight. Several women paused to examine woven linen cloth. Their fingers moved slowly across the smooth fabric, feeling the careful work hidden within every thread. One woman nodded with quiet approval before exchanging a small measure of grain for a folded length of cloth. The trade was simple, Both families would benefit. That was enough. A little farther away, an elderly basket maker sat beneath the welcome shade of a sycamore tree. Around him lay bundles of freshly cut reeds gathered from the edge of the Nile. His fingers moved almost without thought. One reed crossed another. Then another. Slowly the round shape of a basket appeared. Young children occasionally wandered over to watch. They were fascinated by the way straight reeds slowly curved into strong walls. One curious boy finally asked, "How do you know where each reed belongs?" The old man smiled kindly. He looked down at the basket resting in his lap. "It tells me," he answered softly. The child looked puzzled. The old man chuckled very quietly. "Not with words," he continued. "Only with patience." The boy nodded, though he understood only part of the answer. Perhaps many years later, while weaving his own basket, the meaning would become clearer. Inside a nearby workshop, the steady tapping of stone echoed gently against thick mud-brick walls. A mason carefully shaped a limestone block with a copper chisel and a smooth wooden mallet. Each strike was measured. Not too hard. Not too soft. Tiny chips fell onto the growing pile at his feet. The block slowly became smoother. Its edges grew straighter. He paused often, running his hand across the surface before deciding where the next careful strike should fall. The work rewarded patience far more than strength. His apprentice gathered the stone fragments into baskets. Even these small pieces would find another use. Nothing valuable was carelessly discarded. Across the lane, the familiar scratching of reed pens continued inside the scribe's quiet room. Sunlight entered through the doorway, forming a bright rectangle upon the floor. Dust drifted lazily through the beam of light. The scribe hardly noticed. His attention remained upon the neat rows of symbols spreading across the papyrus before him. Occasionally he paused to sharpen the tip of his reed pen with a small knife. Then the writing continued. Steady. Careful. Unhurried. Each mark preserved another ordinary detail of life beside the Nile. Outside, the village carried on with its gentle rhythm. Water jars were refilled. Children swept courtyards. Goats wandered slowly toward shaded places. A potter carried newly shaped vessels into the sunlight to begin drying. Two young brothers carefully repaired a woven fishing basket under the watchful eye of their grandfather. No task seemed especially important when viewed alone. Together, they supported everything. As the morning slowly approached its warmest hours, people naturally adjusted their pace. More frequent pauses appeared between tasks. A drink of cool water from a clay jar. A few moments beneath the shade of a palm. A quiet conversation with a neighbor. These brief rests were not interruptions. They were simply another part of the day's rhythm. The civilization itself seemed to breathe this way. Work. Rest. Work again. The river flowed without hurry. The fields grew without haste. Children learned little by little. Parents aged one season at a time. Grandparents quietly passed along memories gathered over many decades. Nothing remarkable happened this morning. And yet, everything that truly mattered continued. The bread baked. The canals carried water. The boats floated. The workshops echoed with gentle labor. The homes filled with familiar voices. The ordinary routines repeated themselves once more, just as they had yesterday, and just as they would again tomorrow. Under the warm Egyptian sun, these simple acts performed with patient hands and peaceful hearts continued to build something far greater than any one person could ever see, a civilization held together not by extraordinary moments, but by the quiet faithfulness of everyday life beside the eternal Nile. The warmth of late morning settled gently across the valley. The sun now stood high enough that its light reached nearly every corner of the village. The cool shadows that had stretched comfortably across the paths after sunrise had quietly retreated beneath walls, palm trees, and woven shelters. People welcomed these patches of shade whenever they could, stepping into them for a few moments before returning to their work. The air shimmered softly above the fields. Beyond the village, the fertile land slowly gave way to the pale desert, where waves of heat danced above the sand. The contrast had always been there. On one side, rich soil fed by the Nile supported gardens, grain, orchards, and homes. On the other, the quiet desert stretched toward distant hills, still and almost endless. The people rarely thought of this balance. To them, it was simply the world as it had always been. A young farmer paused beside an irrigation canal. He knelt and dipped both hands into the cool water. For a few moments he simply let the river's gift flow over his fingers. The water felt wonderfully refreshing after the growing warmth of the morning. He splashed a little across his face. Tiny drops clung briefly to his skin before disappearing into the dry air. He smiled, stood, and returned to his work. Not far away, another farmer examined a wooden yoke resting across the shoulders of two patient oxen. The leather bindings had loosened slightly during the morning. He untied one knot, adjusted the strap, and secured it again with practiced hands. The animals waited quietly. They trusted the familiar rhythm. When the work was finished, the man gently patted the neck of the older ox. The animal blinked slowly before continuing forward. Kindness toward working animals was rarely dramatic. It appeared in small gestures. A moment of shade. Fresh water. A careful adjustment that prevented discomfort. The animals shared the labor of the land, and many families treated them with quiet respect. Across another field, a group of women harvested onions. The green tops rustled softly whenever the breeze crossed the rows. Each onion was loosened from the rich earth with careful fingers before being placed into a woven basket. Soon the baskets became pleasantly heavy. One woman laughed quietly as she tried lifting hers onto her shoulder. Her friend stepped beside her without hesitation. Together they raised it. The effort lasted only a few seconds. Then both continued with their own work as though nothing unusual had happened. Helping one another required no ceremony. It belonged naturally to the day. Nearby, several children gathered beneath a broad sycamore tree while waiting for the adults to finish nearby tasks. One little boy drew shapes in the dust using a thin stick. He carefully traced the outline of a fishing boat. Then he added the curved sail his father often raised when the wind was favorable. His younger sister watched with great attention. Soon she began drawing beside him. Her lines wandered more freely. She smiled at her own creation. The children spoke softly about whose boat might catch the most fish. Their conversation drifted away on the breeze almost as quickly as it had begun. An elderly grandmother sitting nearby watched them with gentle amusement. She continued weaving a basket while occasionally glancing toward the children. Her hands never seemed to stop moving. One reed folded beneath another. Then another. The basket slowly grew upward. Her fingers had performed these same motions for so many years that they no longer required careful thought. Instead, her mind wandered peacefully through memories. She remembered carrying water from the river as a young girl. She remembered learning to bake bread beside her own mother. She remembered the first small basket she had woven many decades before. Its sides had been uneven. Its handle had loosened after only a few weeks. She smiled at the memory. Skill had not arrived in a single afternoon. It had come one patient day at a time. Near the center of the village, the baker removed another round of warm bread from the clay oven. The crust had turned a beautiful golden color. The smell drifted through nearby streets, inviting quiet smiles from everyone passing by. Fresh bread had a remarkable way of making even an ordinary day feel comforting. The baker placed each loaf onto a woven cloth to cool. He gently tapped the bottom of one loaf with his knuckles. The sound told him everything he needed to know. It had baked well. His father had taught him this simple habit many years before. Now his own son stood nearby, watching closely. The boy listened to the same hollow sound. He tried tapping another loaf himself. The baker nodded with approval. No long explanation followed. Some lessons belong to the ears as much as the eyes. Across the marketplace, merchants continued their quiet exchanges. A fisherman traded part of his morning's catch for fresh vegetables. A shepherd exchanged wool for several new clay jars. A carpenter selected a bundle of strong rope woven from flax fibers. No one appeared hurried. Conversations unfolded naturally. People knew one another's families. They remembered names, seasons, and small kindnesses offered months or even years before. Trust had grown slowly over many harvests. It became another invisible foundation supporting village life. Along one edge of the marketplace, an old storyteller rested beneath a woven shade. He was no official teacher. No one gathered because they had been instructed to do so. People simply enjoyed hearing his calm voice while taking short rests from their work. Today he spoke about the Nile. Not of mighty floods or famous rulers. Instead, he remembered watching the river beside his father when he had been only a small child. He described mornings filled with mist. The quiet splash of wooden oars. The scent of wet reeds. Children listened with wide eyes. Adults smiled gently. Many had lived through similar mornings themselves. The stories reminded them that ordinary memories often became the most precious with time. Not far away, the potter carefully lifted yesterday's finished jars. He inspected each one beneath the sunlight. Some would soon be filled with grain. Others would hold cool drinking water. One particularly large vessel had been made for storing olive oil brought by merchants from distant lands. The potter gently brushed away a little dust from its smooth surface. His hands lingered for a moment. Every jar carried a small piece of himself. Though he rarely thought about it, families across many villages would quietly depend upon the work of his hands. As the sun climbed even higher, more people paused beneath the shade whenever possible. Water jars became busier than workshops. Clay cups passed from hand to hand. The water tasted cool and clean, carrying with it the gentle freshness of the Nile. A young girl carefully refilled several cups for older workers repairing a canal. She moved from one person to another without spilling a drop. Each accepted the water with quiet gratitude. The pauses were brief. Soon everyone returned to work. The canal repair continued. Fresh mud strengthened the banks. Loose stones were pressed firmly into place. Water flowed steadily once again. A simple repair. An ordinary morning. Yet another quiet act that protected the fields beyond. Above the village, swallows circled effortlessly through the bright sky. Their swift movements contrasted with the slower rhythm below. People rarely looked up for long. The birds would return tomorrow. The fields would still need tending. Bread would still need baking. Children would continue learning. The river would continue flowing. There was deep comfort in this gentle certainty. The people did not measure the worth of a day by unusual events. A good day was one in which the bread baked well. The canals carried water. The animals remained healthy. The family gathered together once the evening came. Those quiet blessings were enough. And so the hours continued to pass, almost unnoticed, as patient hands shaped clay, turned soil, mended nets, carried water, recorded harvests, and prepared simple meals. Each small task slipped quietly into the next, joining thousands of others in the steady rhythm that, season after season and generation after generation, continued to build the ordinary routine that became the enduring heart of an ancient civilization beside the timeless waters of the Nile. The day had slowly unfolded from darkness into light, from cool morning air into the warmth of the afternoon, and at last toward another peaceful evening. The sun, which had watched over the fields, the workshops, the boats, and the quiet streets, now drifted gently toward the western desert. Its golden light softened with every passing moment, painting the mud-brick homes in warm shades of amber and honey. Long shadows stretched across the village once more, just as they had the day before, and the day before that, and through countless seasons that no one living could fully remember. The work was finished for now. Wooden hose rested against cool walls. Fishing nets, still carrying the faint scent of the river, were folded with careful hands. Clay jars stood full beside doorways. Fresh bread cooled upon woven cloths. The day's final cooking fires burned low, their gentle smoke rising into the evening sky before disappearing into the quiet air. Families gathered together once again. Children leaned against tired parents. Grandparents smiled softly as familiar stories returned, not because they were new, but because they were loved. Simple meals were shared without hurry. Hands reached for bread. Clay cups passed from one person to another. Gentle conversation floated through the village like the evening breeze. No one needed extraordinary moments. The ordinary day had been enough. Above them, the first stars slowly appeared. One by one, they filled the heavens until the entire sky seemed alive with quiet light. The Nile reflected them all. Its patient waters carried the stars upon their surface, just as they had carried fishing boats, bundles of reeds, and gentle hopes through the daylight hours. The river continued its endless journey. It did not rush. It never hurried toward tomorrow. It simply flowed, calm and steady, reminding every soul beside its banks that life itself often moved most beautifully when it followed its own peaceful rhythm. The breeze grew cooler. Palm leaves whispered softly together. Reeds along the shoreline swayed with slow grace. Somewhere in the distance, an owl greeted the coming night. A donkey shifted gently in its shelter before becoming still again. The village slowly quieted. One lamp after another was carefully covered. Doorways grew dark. Footsteps faded. The sounds of conversation became softer until they blended completely with the gentle murmur of the river. Inside every home, woven sleeping mats were unrolled. Blankets were gently shaken free of dust before being spread across the floor. Children, already heavy-eyed from the day's small adventures and simple chores, curled beside their families. Parents rested nearby, comforted by the familiar breathing of those they loved. Outside, the moon rose quietly above the eastern horizon. Its pale light rested upon the rooftops, the palm trees, and the calm waters of the Nile. The great temples stood silently in the distance. The fields waited patiently for another sunrise. The boats rocked gently against their moorings. Everything that had worked so faithfully during the day now rested together beneath the peaceful sky. The people of ancient Egypt could not know that thousands of years later their names would mostly be forgotten. They could not imagine distant generations wondering how such a remarkable civilization came to be. But perhaps the answer had always been wonderfully simple. It was built in quiet kitchens where bread was kneaded before dawn. It was built beside canals where careful hands guided water toward waiting fields. It was built inside workshops where patient craftsmen shaped wood, stone, clay, and linen without seeking praise. It was built by scribes who counted grain carefully, by fishermen who trusted the river, by children who learned through watching, by grandparents who shared gentle wisdom at sunset, by mothers who lit the morning fire, by fathers who repaired worn tools before sleep, by neighbors who lifted heavy baskets together, by ordinary people whose greatest achievement was not glory, but faithfulness. One ordinary day became another. One season gently followed the next. Years became generations. Generations became centuries. And slowly, almost invisibly, those countless quiet routines became one of the world's most enduring civilizations. Now, the village sleeps. The river keeps flowing beneath the stars. The desert breathes softly beyond the fields. The cool night wind carries the scent of reeds, fresh water, and warm earth across the silent valley. Nothing asks for your attention anymore. There is nowhere to hurry. No work left to finish. Only the peaceful sound of the Nile moving through the darkness, as it has for thousands upon thousands of nights. So let the stars drift quietly overhead. Let the gentle breeze grow softer with every passing moment. Let the voices of the ancient world fade into the distance, until only the calm river remains. And as the timeless waters continue their slow journey through the sleeping valley, may your own thoughts become as quiet as the moonlit Nile, as steady as its gentle current, and as peaceful as an ancient Egyptian night that never truly ends. Sleep well.